Good afternoon to you, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion for Monday, February 5th, 2018. Let's begin today's tour by looking at the SOI. Pretty negative as of late, minus 19 for today, and the long-term averages are going down as well. What is the reason behind that? Well, nobody ever really understands exactly why some of these things happen. A lot of it has to do with the Madden-Julian oscillation and how that aligns itself around the globe, and the pressure patterns change. But exactly what kicks these things off, I think, remains a bit of a mystery. So what we do is we simply track the results of it anyway. And there's other people that study this stuff closer than I do, the MJO and the SOI, and how all of that relates to the what we call the ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon. But for the layperson, what we're really looking for are these numbers here, especially the 30 and 90 day. Once these become negative, then we really start to look and see if there's an El Nino possible, because that usually adversely affects the Atlantic hurricane season, keeping the overall numbers and the intensity of storms and hurricanes down. And we saw that in a big way in 2015. Yet, however, even that year, we had very powerful Hurricane Joaquin in the southwest Atlantic, ravaging portions of the Bahamas. In 1992, somewhat of an El Nino year. Of course, you heard about Hurricane Andrew, and there are other examples. But typically, when we have a warm ENSO event or an El Nino period, then the Atlantic basin is usually fairly quiet. So we'll keep watching this and see what happens. Right now, a fairly significant crash of the Southern Oscillation Index, and that's had some results here impacting the subsurface temperatures in a way, although this is going to take a little bit longer to manifest itself. Remember, the surface of the Pacific Ocean is up here at the top, and we're about 450 meters deep down here. This is like a slice through the ocean along the equatorial Pacific, and this also shows us the anomalies, the departures from normal. All of this blue in here is your La Nina fracturing, saying bye-bye. It's going to go away. We're going to revert back to a more neutral pattern. But then in the western Pacific, in the subsurface, a large area and fairly deep of warm or positive anomalies. Nothing too strong, nothing like we saw starting in 2015 around this time. It's probably later into March and April. But this is something to watch. And there are a few people starting to hint that maybe an El Nino sets up this year in the fall and winter. So perhaps not soon enough to impact the Atlantic hurricane season. And by the way, El Nino really was a winter phenomenon starting in December into January, as the fishermen off the coast of Peru would notice it. Around the time of Christmas, the anchovy stock was really low because the waters, which were normally cooler and nutrient-rich, were warmer, and the fish stocks were lower, and that had a big impact on the settlements along the west coast of South America, and it usually started to really manifest itself around the time of Christmas. Anyway, so it's normally something that doesn't happen in the summer, but it starts to sort of ramp up. But we'll watch this. As you can clearly see, again, these large areas of cold anomalies are starting to fracture and break up. And overall, it's a neutral pattern setting up for later on down the road. Now, what does it look like at the surface? Let's go ahead and get to that. The surface map here shows still a very large area of cold anomalies here in the equatorial Pacific, extending all the way out past the date line just a little bit into the western Pacific. The North Pacific up here, for what it's worth, colder than we have seen in recent years. You remember back just a few years ago, the North Pacific, very, very warm compared to average. And looking at the Atlantic, and I'm going to compare this to last year in just a minute, a little bit of a cool down here in the eastern Atlantic due to the strong NAO, or the North Atlantic Oscillation, being positive. And that's just a fancy way of saying that, for the most part, we've had strong high pressure sitting out here, and that's created some pretty strong trade winds. This is an oversimplification of it, but that gives you the idea that stronger trade winds have been blowing from east to west out here, and that's helped to stir up the water upwell some colder water from beneath, etc., and so forth. Now, if we look at what the map was like a year ago, I like to compare things. Obviously, the big difference was in the tropical Pacific, where we had one little island of cool here, a very, very warm eastern Pacific, and then overall the Atlantic Basin looks very similar last year to what it looks like today. So here's today, and here's last year. The big change I see from last year to today, notice right up here, a very large area, spatially speaking, it covers a large area of the ocean. I don't want to confuse a large aerial coverage with a large number above or below normal. Okay, that's very important. So it's a large area covering the North Atlantic this year versus last year. It's a little bit warmer this year. Why is that important? Well, when the North Atlantic is warmer, then, especially if we look this year, what we have going on in the South Atlantic, this warm, and we'll put a positive over cold, that difference usually means a busy hurricane season ahead. But, of course, it's only February, and we have to see if this persists. But it, was warmer than it was this time last year, for what it's worth, and we saw what happened last hurricane season. So there might be a little bit of a correlation. The main thing I take away from this is that we can watch this on a weekly basis and see how it evolves. Even though it might not have any ramifications today, I understand that. Being able to monitor it in real time, week after week, to see how it evolves, helps us to see where things might be headed as we get into June and beyond. All right, so that's all it is. We're just analyzing what's happening. No need to look at any forecasts or plumes or whatever. Some of those things are just, they're not helpful yet. Probably need another 10 to 15 years for those models to really grasp 3 to 6 months out. So I like to look at the here and now, look at what we might have seen in the past, and make a few deductions about what happens for the future. You can deduce from what you see what might happen. All right, anyway, spring break still a few weeks away once you get into March, and if you head down to the northern Gulf Coast, you better bring your wetsuit, fairly cold water temperatures. But here is that 26-degree isotherm nosing its way up out of the Yucatan Channel into the Gulf of Mexico. Now that it is February, the days are getting longer. Yay, that's great. And the sun angle slowly increasing. That means there is more energy being put into the oceans now north of the equator. It's a very slow process, obviously, and barring any major massive Arctic outbreaks that brings cold air down into the Gulf and sweeping across with deep frontal penetration all the way down into the Caribbean, which could still happen, overall sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico from south to north will continue to warm. Well, obviously, now that we're past the shortest days, that's what's supposed to happen. And we can track this, of course, every week as well. And it is going to be interesting once you get to spring break season. If we don't get any major frontal passages through this area, these shelf water temperatures could moderate some. Still going to be in the 60s, but nevertheless, bring the wetsuit if you're headed, maybe look at down here, even South Padre Island, probably some offshore wind coming off there, upwelling some cold water down there along the Padre Island region. Moving along to the western Atlantic off the east coast here, I do love this gradient, the difference between temperature over distance, and you can really see that gradient show up. 24 degrees Celsius here, 23 degrees Celsius. So, nothing out of the ordinary that really catches your attention if we go back and look at the anomalies. Right off the southeast coast, a little bit colder than normal, and then the northwest Atlantic quite a bit warmer than normal. That's been the case for several years in a row. For some strange reason, it has held on. But again, no major temperature differences over the western Atlantic. And without any Arctic air and jet stream buckling down into the south, like we saw in early January with that one big winter storm, we're not seeing any major winter storms, just these smaller systems, some rainfall for the south where you need it. Unfortunately, if we look out west, Amarillo, a record for the longest amount of time with no precipitation, and then the southwest over here as well. Dry drought conditions starting to manifest itself again as we would expect in a La Nina pattern typically drier along the south, and that's what we are seeing. And today's weather map here from the weather.gov site, fairly quiet overall, bitterly cold up along the northern tier states, but that's pretty much where it's confined for now, and I can show you that if we go to Levi Cowan's website. By the way, he had the awesome distinction of being I guess you would say like top ranked if you search for weather models. I don't remember the exact search terms, but he tweeted about it that Google moved him up to number 1. And that's a big deal. That's great. It's good to see people pioneering something that everybody is thankful for. I know I am, and he makes it available free of charge. He does, like we do, have the Patreon. So he had it listed on this page? No, he doesn't. Yeah, right there. It's a tiny little thing. You can support Levi by becoming a patron. I just wanted to point that out. So congratulations to Levi. And it makes it so that we can look at these models. I love the way we can go through and see the different layers here, the color code. The INCEPT site's great too, but the interface here at tropicaltidbits.com is fantastic. So, that being said, let's look at the next 7 days in terms of lower 48 weather. And let me change my color to red. So here is your 500 millibar pattern, just to kind of give you what's what here. And you can see there's some broad troughing overall in the east, but it's a very wide trough, if you will. It's not some sharp longitudinal deep trough like that, okay? So watch what happens over the next week or so. I'm going to just move through these frames very quickly. A little bit of ridging starts to build over the southwest Atlantic and down into the Caribbean, as you can see right there. And then you have heights building over the southeast into the mid-Atlantic, so no major winter storms or cold air when you see that. Out west, a little bit of a cutoff low trying to develop here from the 500 millibar pattern over time. This is about a week out, coming up on a week out, 6 days. Maybe some precip coming out of this as this system drops into Arizona. We'll see, the southwest U.S. Meanwhile, over the Atlantic here, pretty large area of high pressure developing, keeping the cold air at bay. I'm going to tell you, when you see this kind of flow moving from west to east and it's not coming out of Canada, hopefully you don't need me to tell you that that means it's not going to be very cold. And that's fine with me. I'm about done with winter myself. If we're not going to have any big winter storms, let's just move on into spring and summer and the convective season. Thank you very much. So moving on out past a week, again, if you look out, west, maybe some troughing out this way, more storminess over the Rockies and the Great Basin, whereas the southeast and the east coast as a whole, if this verifies, moderating from where we have seen right on towards the end of February. I mean, we're going way out into time. This is 8 days, so that's enough. Beyond that time, it's really, a coin toss. But you get the idea. If we go back to the beginning just real quick, and you see over time really not much of a chance of any major East Coast storms, as the jet stream pattern just doesn't favor it. Very progressive with the systems going across. A little bit of a dip out west, like I mentioned, coming up on 4 to 5, 6 days out, but nothing major in the east, so I'll take it. I'm ready for warmth. One thing I want to mention. Sometimes, if you watched the Super Bowl last night, you saw this. If you saw the commercials, sometimes our pop culture and the weather and weather events coincide with each other. And I thought this was interesting. I'm going to keep the audio muted, just kind of show you in the background. This was from Budweiser, and the whole setup of this was that they switched over from making beer. And we've known this, but I just thought it was interesting that in the Super Bowl, we saw a commercial referencing, and if we go back here, the hurricanes. It starts out here with Texas, Harvey, Irma, Maria, and then, of course, the California wildfires. And, that they switch over to donating water, etc. And that's a lot of money to be poured into something like that on a very, very big night for people watching. And I notice stuff like that when pop culture, and that's what NFL football is. It's part of our big pop culture here in America and worldwide. People watch it. And, I just thought that was interesting when the two sort of cross paths in a positive way. We see so much negative today. I thought that was interesting. And also, remember, if you heard at the beginning and saw that J.J. Watt was an NFL's player Person of the Year, I think they called it, and I think we all know why. From all the money he raised and the efforts he put in. And you know what's interesting? I'm not going to lie. Until Harvey, I don't really follow the NFL that closely. I did not know who J.J. Watt was. But now I do. And it was interesting because I got a pizza, like the first night that I was back in Houston when everything was still open. I got a Papa John's pizza, and there was J.J. Watt right on the cover, of the pizza box. And I was like, oh, okay, that's who that is. And because he was all over Twitter raising money. So anyway, I just thought I'd point that out. Interesting to me, maybe it is to you. Pop culture, hurricanes, weather, it's all related. It affects everybody. We're people, and these things have big impacts on us, and it lasts for generations sometimes. So we saw a little bit of that last night. Even as subtle as it may have been, there it was. All right, have a great rest of your week. It's good to be back doing this on a Monday. I'm making great progress on the 2017 documentary. Later this week, maybe Thursday, Friday, we'll see. I'm going to put out another little couple of minute teaser on the Hurricane Irma chapter, just to keep everybody hooked, if you will. And then by March, I hope to have everything wrapped up. Very, very impressive documentary. At least I think so. I'm biased. What can I say? Hopefully you'll like it as well. Have a great rest of your Monday. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. We'll talk again next week.